Sanbonan Dumlang, hello, it's Simply Svisa here and welcome back to my YouTube channel, but also a special welcome to you if you're listening to the audio podcast, Simply Do the Work. Now, before I get into today's video, I do want to preface and say that almost, okay, we could say like a disclaimer, right, to say that I'll be speaking in the most general terms when it comes to these topics. I also recognize how sensitive and triggering they will be, so I won't necessarily go into sort of details. And I also, because I'm still educating myself on these things, I don't want to speak I don't want to spread and perpetuate misinformation, because I recognize how toxic or harming and damaging that can be. That being said, if you're not yet subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button. Sorry, I bumped the mic there. Do hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can be notified every time I upload a new video. Also, to the podcast listeners, I actually have another podcast episode that I recorded before this, but I was like, you know what, this seems a little bit more pressing, so there's another podcast episode coming out. But after that podcast episode, I don't know when the next one will be, because I'm going back to Res. And so, not to say that I can't record a podcast at Res, but I think I just want to first just readjust, figure out how my routine's going to look when I'm at Res. And then I'll probably have to talk to my roommate. Just recording a podcast from Res will have a lot more logistics, a lot more planning will be needed than when I was doing it here at home, in my room. But that's neither here nor there. As you can probably tell by the title, today we're going to be discussing the issues of gender-based violence and police brutality. And to be honest, I recognize that right now, not only in the continent of Africa, but all over the world, there's just so much happening. There's just so much injustice and inequality, and it can be overwhelming. I honestly did feel overwhelmed, and that was one of also the reasons why I recorded the last podcast episode, about setting boundaries and protecting my peace. And this is a point that I didn't mention in that episode, but I do feel is important, is that there's nothing wrong with you taking a step back. For example, not logging into social media because of how triggering it can be. Because I do think sometimes people make you feel guilty or shame you. No, you need to stay informed. No, you need to this, and that. But it's I do think at the same time, it's important that we also take care of our mental health the way possible. But I also recognize that there is also a bit of privilege involved there, right? Because also if you're not in the heat of the injustice, right? If you're not within that situation, I don't know how to explain it, but if that's not your lived experience, then there is a privilege that comes with being able to choose whether or not you engage or not. But I also do think also if that is your experience, right, and you feel you need to be fighting constantly for your community or for your people, it does take its toll. And so I do think also we need to be also put empathetic. That's why I can be empathetic to activists, people who are on the front lines, when they sometimes don't say the correct thing. That's why I think I can also be a little bit understanding, but that's neither here nor there. If you are active on social media, I'm sure by now most of us have seen all the different hashtags for all the different African countries, and it's really heartbreaking, right, to see that in 2020 this is what we're experiencing. This is our lives. And it almost seems as if African cries are falling on deaf ears. Now, this isn't to say that, now obviously, right, it's the same thing with Black Lives Matter. We're not saying that other countries, other continents don't have their own. I've seen even in Asia, there are also, certain parts of Asia, there are riots and protests breaking out. And also they're dealing with police brutality, right? I feel like somehow police brutality, it's almost been, how can I put this? In our mind, I think a lot of us think of it as just being a North American issue or a British issue, not realizing that I think fundamentally what I'm seeing is that the issue is just in the policing system, the way it is, the way it's been built, right? It's not just, obviously, if we look in America, there's obviously, they've got the issue of, police brutality, but it's also got a heavy racial underbelly to it, right? And so I think that's maybe also why when it happens in other countries, people I don't know what I think I'm literally thinking out loud, like, maybe do people get disconnected because they think police brutality is just at its root a racial issue, and so when race isn't a motivating factor, they don't understand why, or they don't understand how it can be an issue, how it can be problematic. And so after George Floyd's death, right, and the protests that went up around there, I remember noticing a lot of conversation around defunding the police, abolishing the police. And obviously this isn't new lingo, this isn't new, these aren't new talking points, but it was the first time I was actually taking notice of them. And they were kind of like, they were kind of like scary. I was kind of like, what does this mean? Let me actually start doing some research on this, because like, I think we can initially have the initial response of, oh no, but how can you abolish the police? I mean, who's going to protect us? How are we going to be safe? Like, all these questions that come into play. But while through that, just deep diving and understanding what people mean when they say defund the police, abolish the police, I ended up actually understanding that, yeah, actually, this whole system is just, I've reached that point where I don't think the police can be reformed. Like, I don't think the issue is reformation, because the police, I mean, like, take South Africa, for example, right? If you look at in most parts of the world, actually, right, police were put in place to sort of control the slaves, to keep control of slaves or of the general population. It's basically to protect the ideals or the wishes of those in power. That is what the police are actually doing. But then, they also do put in it, oh no, but they're there to protect civilians, they're there to keep the law. And, I mean, they do that, but statistically, I think that's also why I'm looking at it. It's kind of like, but it ain't working. The system isn't working. So maybe we should just throw it away. Because look, in South Africa, right, the police were initially used to keep the apartheid laws in place. And then, of course, when the democratic government came in, I'm sure they tried to do some reformations. But we've seen incidents like Marikana and Feesmas 4, where the police were doing exactly the same thing that happened during the apartheid era. And it's kind of like that, and that's where you also see that it's not about individuals, because people will tell you, oh no, but you can't be talking bad about cops, because not all cops are like that. It's the same energy as when we're talking about gender-based violence, and we're like, but not all men. But it's like, okay, look, like that's not the conversation we're having. It's not. And when you when you come with these weak counter arguments, it's very distracting from the real issue, right? Even if you look at gender-based violence, I saw statistics, and I'm not going to try to say the figures because I forgot the exact figures, but I'm saying that there's a large number of police officers who are perpetrators of gender-based violence. And it's kind of like, now who do you go to? Right? Because we're told that the police are there to protect us. If someone does a crime against you, you go to the police. But where do you go if the crime against you is being enacted by the police? And yes, I know that there are so-called, there are channels and, powers above the police that are put in place. But also then the problem is, what happens if the ones in power, the ones ruling the state, are the ones who are sending the police to commit violence against innocent civilians? What happens then? Before I filmed this, I was watching a video. It was a poem, and there was a line in there that struck me that said, your source of protection is now your death sentence. Because I think for a lot of people, for example, if you're a woman or you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, chances are, if you had a crime enacted against you, you would not want to go to the police. You would not necessarily feel comfortable going to the police, especially depending on the nature of the crime and the circumstances, right? Because you just have, violence was just enacted on you, and now you fear that, what if by going to the police, I subject myself to even more violence? That is a real threat and concern. And we have cases of police officers violating victims who are seeking help. And that is where I'm just like, what can happen? And even just as I was mentioning how we've got a variety of countries, right, on social media, different hashtags. It was rather disappointing, though not surprising, the xenophobia that some people were tweeting. People saying that, oh, they're so tired of seeing about these Nigerian protests. People like even just, or like, just let me not get into it because I'm not trying to trigger anyone. But it's kind of like, and I think I've said this before, people are very aware of the violence enacted upon them, right? People are very aware of the systems oppressing them. But not everyone is doing the work to see, but how am I inflicting violence on others? How am I oppressing others? Or what other oppressive systems exist out there that are affecting others, even if I might not necessarily be directly a part of it? But because the thing is, until we're all free, the reality is none of us are free, as cliche as it might sound. And that's also something I've also touched on, is like, you can't dismantle one oppressive system and leave another standing and think, well, you know what, the systems that oppressed me, I've dismantled them, good luck to the rest of y'all. Because it's kind of like, if you leave any oppressive system standing, it's sort of, it gives almost like, it'll be the back door that the system that you thought you had put down, it'll give that system a back door to come back. And I think that's also why I do also recognize how that it is a privilege to choose whether or not you engage in certain conversations, right? If you have the choice, or if you feel like, oh, this is so annoying, or oh, okay, Sizwile, okay, we've been new. If you feel like that when someone else is speaking on their injustice, know that you are in a privileged position in that conversation. Because if you are a marginalized individual, you don't have the choice. You don't have the luxury of whether or not you engage in your oppression. You don't have that luxury. And so I do think we also, each person needs to sort of introspect for ourselves, because I do think that, in fact, I do know that I also have been complicit. I also have had those moments where I'm like, oh, this issue is so far from me. I'm not going to even get involved. But then what happens when it is, in my backyard's on fire? Then I'll be screaming and crying and wanting everyone to help me. And this isn't to sort of, I think also another thing that ends up happening is then people start feeling like we're competing for attention, which I don't think should necessarily be the case. Like, this isn't a case of struggle Olympics, right? For example, now, even like within the gender-based violence conversation, right? I often question and like to wonder, where do LGBTQ plus individuals fit into that? Because we have to acknowledge that most of the time when a queer person is attacked, a lot of the times it does have to do with their gender identity or their gender expression, right? Especially if it's someone who is transgressing certain gender norms, right? Someone who was assigned female at birth, who's expressing their gender in a masculine way, or someone who's assigned male at birth expressing a more feminine gender, right? Those tend to invite violence. And even though the law has been put in a way which says that we all have rights, it's not being implemented that way, right? And that is also why I wonder, what is the role of law enforcement? Are they really there to enforce the law, or do they only enforce certain laws based on who's benefiting from them? And so on the question of, okay, when we abolish the police, then what? I feel like there's some people who be like, okay, listen, when I look at it, okay, I see how the police are toxic, I see how the police are harmful, I see how the police are failing us. But isn't this broken system better than nothing? And I think that's also where, there are a ton of people who've done great work on this, talk about how the reality is we'd have to create something completely new. But also, if we look at the past historically, the police weren't always there. Like, policing as we know it wasn't always there. And so I do understand how, in our context, right, we can't imagine a world without police because that's all we've known. But you think about how in the past, historically, many tribes had a more communal type of a more communal system, right? Where the community was more actively involved in the police. I think also one of my biggest issues with the police, and this is sort of like moving onto just with general crimes, right? Is that, sorry, bump the mic again. The police only show up after the crime, after the matter of fact, right? If, for example, like the thing is, I feel like there are no systems really in place for example, if I suspect that someone is being abused, if I call the police, they'll need to know what evidence is there. Like they might show up, but if there's no like real concrete evidence, they'll be like, it is what it is, right? Also, the topic of just like mental health, and I just feel like there are a lot of things which have been handed on to the police which shouldn't be in there. Okay, for example, someone's having a mental health crisis and maybe they're being violent or whatever the case might be. Most of us would probably think to call the police. But the thing is, the police most of the time probably aren't trained to deal with someone in that state. And so that's, I think, there's just so much ground to cover. There's just so much to unpack on what to do. And even the issue of the criminal justice system, right? Even that is just a mess. Like I'm no longer at that point where people are like, oh no, like let's trust the law, trust the process, because statistically, or at least from what I've experienced or read or what I know, it doesn't always work. The criminal justice system doesn't always favor the innocent, And even when you think of correctional services, when someone's in jail, what is actually happening? Like, are they because a lot, like, it's called correctional services because it's supposed to like correct the incorrect behavior, but also the statistics. I've been saying that word so many times. Why am I tripping over it now? The statistics show that a lot of times when criminals are released from prison, they go ahead and they commit the exact same crime, if not worse, sometimes even worse than the ones they got convicted for. And also, if you think about it, there is a ton of criminals who might never ever be caught, who will just continue the cycle. And also thinking about it, just talk about how cyclic this thing can be. People who have experienced violence on them sometimes will then turn around and perpetuate violence on others. So maybe if there were systems to break that cycle, right, where if like fathers aren't abusive to their children, like if that cycle can be broken, then those children will not grow up to be abusive to others. And so I'm just looking at my notes here, and I feel like I've said what I wanted to say. I feel like anything else will just be me rambling, making noise. I think that's not what's needed right now. As much as I have opinions, and I would love to share them as I'm doing that right now. I recognize that my opinions aren't the most important, right? Because I am not in the threat of danger as the different people that I've briefly touched on. And that being said, I do want to urge you guys, please do read, do be informed, and find out what you can do. Because I do know, like, kind of like my hand, like it's also another thing that makes it so overwhelming is that we feel like there's nothing we can do. We almost feel like we're just making noise, and it's like, like you feel like no real work's being done. That's why I do urge, like, let's read, research, and also share. Like, if you know of any resources or action steps that can be taken with regards to what's happening just in the world, please do leave them in the comment section below or send them to me. I'll try to look for resources and stuff, and then I'll link those in the description of the video and also in the show notes of the podcast. But that being said, thank you so much for watching, and until I see or hear from you guys, or you hear from me in the next one, I love you so much. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Bye, guys.